Hi, everybody, and welcome to my sci-fi, fantasy, and horror short fiction roundup for November 2020. So this is 17 terrific short stories I read in November this year. And there might be some dog sounds in the background while I'm doing this. I do apologize, but the dog is in the room with me, so we'll see what happens. And I'm going to pretty much launch right into the story countdown, since there are 17 stories to get to. There's a version you can read of this roundup. It's online at curiousfictions.com, and there's links for that in the comments. So my first story pick for this roundup is An Important Failure by Rebecca Campbell in Clarkesworld. Now, this novelette was published earlier this year, but I was reminded of its existence by the wonderful Vanessa Fogg and realized I hadn't included it in a roundup previously. I'm including it now because it's quite simply one of the best stories I've read this year. It's set in British Columbia, the part of the world where I live, and it takes place in a not too distant future when climate change is having a dramatic effect on the flora and fauna and human society. It's a story about trees, and it's a story about violins and music and about growing things. And it's a story about people who live their lives in a world where their choices are shaped by the world's changing climate. I love how Campbell makes the big theme, climate change, affect individual lives on such an intimate, personal level in the story rather than go for some big, dramatic apocalypse. In reading this story, I'm also struck to my core by the exquisite beauty and sharpness of Campbell's prose and by how deftly she captures the feel, sounds, and scents of the Pacific Northwest. It's really something to read a story like this that moves through the future of places I know by heart. The North Shore, Vancouver Island, Burnaby, Vancouver. And Campbell captures it all with such gentle precision. A fabulous, fabulous story. My next story pick is To Sail the Black by A.C. Weiss in Clarkesworld. And I'm going to read an excerpt from this story first. The ghost ship Xanthic Promise sails the black, powered by the slumbering heart of a dying star, and its captain, Antimony Jones, stalks its decks in a swirl of crimson coat and foxfire lightning, dogged by voices. The recent dead, the long dead, and the dead to be, all murmuring as to how she's only 3 months into her command, and it's all coming undone. Now, end quote. Now, Tales about Space Pirates is obviously one of the best science fiction genres. I think a lot of people will agree with me on this one. And Weiss's story is a riveting, salty, bloody tale of ghosts and space pirates, and about a ship powered by a star. What more could you ask for? It's also a tale of a ship that might be foundering, because people are dying under terrible circumstances aboard. And when Captain Antimony finally begins to really listen to those voices in her head and to the ghosts that are tied to the ship even beyond life, she realizes she must do a terrible thing if anyone is going to survive. Terrific story. My next story pick is Silver Door Diner by Bishop Garrison and Faya number 16. If you need a shot of hope and joy at the end of the world, then this sci-fi short story from Faya might be just the thing you need. A boy walks into a diner looking for a slice of apple pie and some conversation. He gets both. But in this diner, nothing is really what it seems. I love this story to bits for its wistful sweetness. And I also love that it keeps that sweetness and its quiet hope that it keeps it even beneath the heavy specter of war, and even as it speaks about the things and about the people that might destroy our world forever. This is a great sci-fi story, and it was just the read I needed this month, sorry. My next story pick is What Friends Don't Tell Friends About Basements by Corey Fahrenkopf in Bourbon Pen. Now, what do you do when you grow up in a house where there are literally monsters in the basement, and it's been your family's task for a couple of centuries to make sure those monsters don't get out? It's bound to cramp your style when you're 16, especially if you have to watch over the monsters on your best friend's birthday when you had other plans. This story captures the intricacies of friendship perfectly, and the complications that occur when you worry you might be drifting apart, and then that best friend of yours insists she wants to see what's really down at the bottom of the basement stairs. Wow. I love this story. Fahrenkopf has a great eye for the details of friendship and also a sly sense of humor. My next story pick is Biography of Algae by Martha Riva Palacio Obon in Strange Horizons. This is a lyrical story that weaves together science and personal memory, history and future, Earth and space. The nature of life on Earth, its history and evolution, and the possibility of other unknown kinds of life on our own planet, and the possibility of life in other parts of our solar system, are all at the heart of this beautiful story. Space exploration, the evolution of algae, depression, and a longing for the sea. I love the way Obon brings together so many different strands into an evocative fictional tapestry. This story is from Strange Horizons special issue featuring work by writers from Mexico, and it's also available to read in Spanish. My next story pick is 5 Tips for Sealing Away an Ancient Evil by Anne LeBlanc in the anthology If There's Anyone Left. This is a really clever and gripping story with a dark sense of humor. I love how LeBlanc weaves backstory and plot into each numbered step and how it all brings us to a suspenseful conclusion. LeBlanc's story is part of the If There's Anyone Left anthology, and it's an anthology full of these kinds of stories. Well-written, entertaining flash fiction with heart, and often with a sense of fun, whether it's overt or more subtle. This anthology project is focused on the voices of marginalized members of the sci-fi/spec community. This includes people of color, the LGBTQ+ community, members of marginalized genders, and disabled people. And you can read more about the project online. My next story pick is also from the same anthology, If There's Anyone Left, and it's called It Is a Beautiful Day on the Internet, and You Are a Horrible Bot, and it's by M.A. Ogden. This is another fantastic story from that anthology, and I started reading this anthology late one night just to get a feel for what kind of fiction it contained, and I was so charmed and thrilled that I kept reading way past my bedtime. Ogden's story puts a new spin on the old AI that gains sentience and causes havoc trope, and instead of disaster, well, it turns out this particular bot causes chaos, but maybe not of the apocalyptic kind. My next story pick is The Silent Partner by Theodore McCombs in the Magazine of Science Fiction and Fantasy. In the story, Mr. Roberts has come to old Mrs. Fowler's house looking to buy a very valuable piece of furniture from her, a Nakashima table, made by George Nakashima when he was interned at Camp Minidoka during World War II. Now, this dark bit of history makes Mr. Roberts uneasy, but not so uneasy that he doesn't want to acquire the table. Mrs. Fowler is apparently in need of cash, so he's reasonably sure he'll be able to make a deal. What follows is a haunting, languid piece of horror where reality and the sins of the past quietly twist and tilt reality. And by the time Mr. Roberts really understands what is going on in Mrs. Fowler's house, it is much, much too late. Excellent piece of fiction. Next up is Nobody Lives Here by H. Pueo in the Dark. Now, my favorite kind of horror story is often the kind, like the previous story, and like this one, which seems to be anchored in reality, but where reality is threaded through, eaten through, slowly but surely by a strange, uncanny gathering darkness. As is the case in the story, where Sarah is living in her first apartment in a building with no other tenants. To quote the story, "There is no one here, no one but me. Out of 90 apartments, 10 in each of the 9 floors, only mine has someone inside, but most have already been sold." Now, she should be enjoying her new digs, but instead she is haunted by memories of her parents' home, haunted by the sounds and the mess and the dirt and the mold and the cockroaches there. She is also increasingly haunted by sounds that shouldn't be there. Sounds and noise from the other supposedly empty apartments in her new building. Now, this story tightens like a noose as you read it, until you can feel the fear right on your own skin. My next story pick is The Bottomless Martyr by John Wiswall in Uncanny Magazine. Content note for this story is self-harm and suicide. And I'm going to start with the quote from the story. It's just one line, but it's so good. "The first time Rang died, it stopped a typhoon," end quote. Yes, when Rang dies, she saves the world, or at least her part of the world. But if that's her power, shouldn't she die again and again in order to save her people? Rang thinks so, at least at first, and she dies again and again and again. It hurts every time. And when people around her catch on, they insist on bringing about her death, and she accepts that too. Until, well, it's complicated. Wiswall's story is wrenching and devastating and hopeful, and that is its brilliance. As Rang is brought back to life again and again, as she runs away and tries to find a new life for herself, she grapples with the mysterious, troubling, magical power she seems to possess. I love the brittle loveliness of the story and the gentle way it looks deep into the heart of abuse and pain, and into how you may find a way out. My next story pick is To Look Forward by Osahon Iyamu in Fantasy Magazine. A powerful, exquisitely crafted story about childhood and play and friendship, and about how adults can intrude on and constrict the freedom of a child's imagination. In the story, we follow a group of children playing on swings. Some of them joyful and daring, some a bit clumsier, but all of them finding a kind of iridescent internal power as they play. Adults intrude, of course, asking about work and studies and obligations, but even then, each child tries to hold on to some part of themselves as they look forward to what it is they want to do with their life and with their power. There's a sense of possibility here, of anticipation, in spite of the adults encroaching on them, as the children try to hold on to their magic, even though they are being pushed to let it go in favor of more real pursuits. This is part of a terrific issue of Fantasy Magazine, by the way. Excuse me 1 second. Jake, stop it. My next story pick is Amber by Sandra M. Odell in Daily SF. I'm going to start with a quote from this story. "Every morning, Mom says, 'Today is the day I get my new body.' And I lie and tell her, 'No, Mom, that's tomorrow.' Then she happily squeals like a rusted nail yanked out of scrap metal. I'm so excited. I can't wait to wear a dress again. End quote. Now this story comes over all soft, almost as quiet as a whisper, but it still broke my heart. Waddell spins a science fiction tale about death and grief and loss, about how we might hold on to things even when cold reason says we should let go. And Odell does all these things with nuance and subtlety. The story takes place in a future where there's a way to let your loved ones live on, in a way, after death. But this afterlife is not without risks and perils. As in all of Odell's work, there's an emotional honesty here that makes the story even more poignant and piercing. My next story pick is Poise and Grace by Kyle Richardson in Flash Fiction Online. This is a beautifully written, wonderful flash fiction story about Dint, who has just finished the project her father built her to do, and who now faces a rather terrible fate. But before that, she has some unexpected time to herself, and she uses it wisely. I love the prose and voice of the story, and I absolutely love the ending. My next story pick is The Genetic Alchemist's Daughter by Elaine Kuyagking at Pseudopod. It's narrated by Rebecca Waisier, and it was first published in the anthology Black Cranes. This is a gorgeous, darkly compelling, devastating horror/sci-fi story about Leto, a young woman who was genetically designed by her mother, Ophelia, to be perfect. Her mother's genetic alchemy business involves, among other things, the creation of prodigals, aka new genetic copies of what you might call failed children, at least in the eyes of their parents, and also the creation of seraphim, aka flawless embryos that grow into exactly the kind of children their parents require. Now, Leto is deeply involved in her mother's business, and when a wealthy woman approaches Ophelia to replace all three of her daughters with improved prodigals, meaning all three originals will be annihilated, it sets in motion a harrowing chain of events for Leto. The slow and deeply unsettling reveal of what is actually going on here is masterfully done, and the ending is a tour de force. Now, my next story is Body Remember by Nicasio Andres Reed in Fireside. This story is set at an archaeological dig near Vesuvius, Italy. And it is a story about the life of Jun, about the things and the people he has lost or left behind, and about the things that haunt him. Reed's story is moving and unsettling in the way a dream or nightmare might be unsettling, skirting so close to what we know is real, but introducing a sliver or ripple of utter, inexplicable strangeness. I especially love the unique setting of the story, the archaeological dig, and the way it weaves together Jun's past with the haunting place he finds himself in now. My next story pick is The Smell of Night in the Basement by Wendy N. Wagner at Pseudopod, narrated by Kara Grace. This story is strong stuff, so be warned. The content warning at Pseudopod says gutter vampires and exploitation, and there's a lot of that here. Wagner's story is told from the point of view of a girl who is being kept as a pet by a vampire who leads a gang of very nasty, very unsparkly, and very unglamorous vampires. When a new girl is brought into the basement, things get topsy-turvy and dangerous fast. There's a real raw, ragged edge to the story, and it pulls no punches when it comes to violence and sex. It's a great read, and it puts a feral twist on the vampire infatuation trope and does something new with a classic monster. Now, my last story pick for this month is The Lachramist by Kat Howard in Lightspeed. And I'm going to read a quote from the story first. She crafts each tear deliberately, water, salt, and memory, in perfect proportions to honor what is gone. She saves each tear that falls. The lachramist has shelves upon shelves of bottles, her tears held in them, colored glass and plain, faceted and smooth, sun-darkened and ice-clear. She stores them to preserve the memories. She stores them against need. End quote. Oh, this is such a gorgeous, beautiful, dark, and gleaming fantasy story, and it has the soul of a poem. It's brimful with sadness, and it's about memory and loss, and about the importance and maybe the peril of remembering and being remembered. Howard's prose is always a treat to read, and that is very true for this story. There's a rhythm and melody to the words that draws me in and keeps me spellbound. And that's it. That was my 17 story picks for this past month. Thanks so much for listening, and until next time.